Good day, friends. We're glad that you can be with us here today, no matter who you are, where you're watching, or when you're watching from. We're really glad that you're here. This is, of course, our online version of the service. We do have services that are happening in person here at St. Andrew's United Church in Moose Jaw, if you happen to be around. This is a really lovely community where I am sure that you would feel welcome. But for now, please join me in prayer. Creating God, we come as we are, trusting that you will accept and welcome. Some are carrying heavy loads and need respite. Others are filled with joy and gratitude and seek to give you praise. Receive each of us into your compassionate embrace and form us into a community of faith-filled people. Open our ears that we may hear your word. Open our mouths that we may speak your truth. Open our hands that we might do your will. For we long to be your people in our words and deeds. We pray to you, who is our mother and our father, who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. When you watch a movie, how do you know who the hero or the villain is? Sometimes I think the villains are kind of set aside that way because they're cast to not be as physically attractive, or sometimes they speak with a different accent, or maybe it's just something as subtle as how the soundtrack might become a little bit more sinister sounding when the villain is on the screen. What often does not indicate who the villain is, though, is their behavior. Have you ever seen the movie The Lion King? The villain is obvious. His name is Scar. That's a pretty big hint. He talks with an accent and a rough voice, and he doesn't have the long flowing mane that the hero of the story does, the majestic lion Mustafa. The thing is, in this movie, Scar is just trying to help the hyenas survive in their exile, which has been imposed on them by Mustafa. And Mustafa himself, well, it's really easy to wax poetic about the circle of life when you're the apex predator. And then there's the Wizard of Oz. Here's the Wicked Witch of the West, who we know is bad because she has green skin. Her sister has just tragically died in some house falling clear out of the sky accident, and she's trying to get her precious family heirloom while she can, the ruby slippers. But no, the so-called good witch, Glenda, has taken those slippers and glued them to the feet of this child, forcing her into an eventual showdown where Dorothy will have to either eliminate Glenda's competition or die trying. It's only after this, only after the so-called Wicked Witch dies in a horrific, gruesome death, that Glenda finally lets on that all Dorothy ever had to do to get home was tap her shoes together? Come on, where was that information at the beginning of the movie? Could have saved a whole bunch of trouble for poor Dorothy. Glenda the Good Witch. Forget that. In the Bible, it can also be pretty hard to accurately gauge who the villains and the heroes are. Yes, Jesus is always the good guy, because, well, it's Jesus. But we've also been conditioned to always assume that the Pharisees are the villains. Take today's reading, for example. This is from Mark chapter 7. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of the disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions which they observe, like the washing of cups and pots and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine. You abandon the commandments of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called a crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile. But the things that come out are what defile. For it is within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person." So here we have the Pharisees antagonizing Jesus and his followers because they're eating without washing their hands. Mark then goes on to say that they also insist on washing their food before they eat it, and they wash their dishes. Well, yeah, isn't that a good thing? Maybe this pandemic has got me a little bit germ-phobic, but I certainly hope that you are all washing your hands and food regularly. And if you are just licking off your dishes before putting them back in the cupboard, please let me know before you invite me over for dinner. These are actually really, really good things that the Pharisees are doing. So we may want to ask, why on earth are they arguing about this? And why on earth is this so important that this conversation makes it not into just one gospel, but two? Well, as is the case whenever I talk to a couple who are arguing about whose turn it is to do house cleaning, this is not about the dishes. It is never about the dishes. First off, let's resist thinking of the Pharisees as the villains in this or any other story in the Bible. Yes, they had many disagreements with Jesus, but this was just a part of their tradition. They were scholars of the Torah. And even today, if you want to hear a heated argument, listen to scholars discuss anything. It can get pretty nasty. But this is all in an effort to arrive at the best possible conclusion. It's not likely that they were just looking to pick a fight. They saw Jesus breaking from tradition and wanted to know why. They knew he was a brilliant teacher, and for the most part, the Pharisees respected Jesus. There's actually a very strong case to be made that Jesus himself was a Pharisee. So, of course they say something. This is a chance for learning and debate. It's also important to look at what they say about eating without clean hands. Their hands are defiled. Now that sounds terrible, doesn't it? To have something defiled sounds really serious. It's been corrupted or spoiled. It's sinful or evil. Not quite. In the Bible, defiled simply means that it is not currently fit for worship in the temple. There are many, many very common ways that a person could be temporarily defiled. It's a part of life. Having dirty hands, coming in contact with blood or a dead body. Women in their menstrual cycle would have been temporarily defiled. It's not that it's wrong or sinful. It just means that they should tidy up before going to church. But still, Jesus has been challenged and the debate is on. This is what the Pharisees lived for, to debate things. So Jesus right away, he gets clever with them and quotes the prophet Isaiah. This is a really good power move. It's like me at Bible study. I've got to throw in a Greek or Hebrew sounding something somewhere because that really does end a debate. The quote he uses talks about people who talk a good talk but don't live out the words that they profess. He says, "They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." This quote also accuses the listener of mixing up, intentionally or otherwise, human tradition and God's law. This is an easy thing to mix up, though. It's tough because the Bible, or for those who were talking to Jesus, the Torah, are full of both tradition and law, and it's not always easy to tell the difference. They often overlap. For example, eating with clean hands. Yes, it is a great idea. But do you think when you're standing at the proverbial pearly gates, do you really think you'll be turned away because you ate strawberries right from the garden instead of washing them first? And then there were all the observances for temple worship. But it says right in the Bible that this is not important to God, but is instead just a tradition, a way of holding on to culture. That's not to say that tradition and culture aren't important, because they are. It's just that when it comes down to the big picture, there might be more important things to talk about and worry about. And I think this is what Jesus might have been referring to. So what is it that's more crucial? What is it that we might think could be God's law rather than simply tradition? Well, the prophet Micah tells us what God requires: to seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Jesus tells us to love God, our neighbors, and ourselves. The famous 10 Commandments are really just a recipe for living in healthy community. Actually, just about everything in the Bible is about just that. Getting along with each other, living in a community without getting too caught up in all of our petty squabbles and fights. It's really about how to get along and live together. All of these readings, Micah and Jesus and the 10 Commandments, those are mostly the things that we should do. Live with justice, for instance. In today's reading, though, it's more about the things that we should not do. Instead of worrying too much about cleanliness traditions, washing our hands and our feet and our dishes and our food, Jesus offers us a list of things that really do corrupt us. Murder, envy, arrogance, foolishness. These are the things that can completely tear a relationship apart, as well as communities. Think about this or any other church. We have a lovely building, and I hope meaningful services with ceremony and music. We have people who are generous with their time and their resources. But in any organization, none of this matters if it comes with what Jesus warns about. If any community, no matter how nice it looks from the outside, is also full of overblown egos and gossiping and slander and bullying, that community will be destroyed faster than leaky roofs or shaky foundations or anything else. When it comes down to knowing what's really important, 66 years ago in United Church, tradition told us that only men could be ordained. But this policy greatly harmed our church's relationship with women, who by this tradition were told that they simply were not as capable as men. 65 years ago, this tradition was abandoned, and the first woman was ordained, coincidentally, right here in St. Andrews. And I believe the United Church started walking just a little bit closer to God's law when that happened. For centuries, it was the church's tradition, based on some very questionable biblical justification. It was the tradition to exclude, deny the existence of, and viciously persecute LGBT people. But finally, after some serious struggle, churches are realizing that this tradition fails in every measure to live into God's law of loving our neighbors and living in open, healthy community. We at this church and so many others have abandoned this tradition and stepped again a little bit closer into living God's law. Tradition is important. It helps us to define who we are as a people. It helps us find belonging through shared experience and cultural identity. In the church, our rituals and practices add depth and beauty to our spiritual lives. But if those practices don't lead to us living more justly, with greater kindness and a greater capacity for hospitality, we're honoring God with our lips, but not allowing God into our hearts. Wash your hands all the time. Do the dishes. But always make sure that what comes out of us is justice, kindness, and humility. And as a church, who you are when you enter this building, whether you got dirty hands or messed up lives, what matters is how you leave. Walking, talking, worshiping messengers of God's love.